Hi, and welcome to the Desert Lady Diaries podcast, a weekly conversation with women who found their home in the Mojave Desert. I'm Dawn Davis, and this is episode number 44. If you're a first-time listener, welcome. And if you're a returning listener, thank you so much for coming back. If you're looking for more information about the podcast, past guests, or want to catch up on previous episodes, or just want to drop me a line, it's all at the website, desertladydiaries.com. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Desert Lady Diaries and on Twitter as Desert Lady Diary. When her husband landed a teaching job in 29 Palms in 1957, Sue McMahon agreed to give the desert a try for 2 years. 60 years later, Sue is still here. Welcome back to Desert Lady Diaries. Today my guest is Sue McMahon, a longtime resident of 29 Palms, and I'm going to read an excerpt from The Desert Trail, dated October 23, 1997, to introduce Sue. Throughout 29 Palms' brief history, community service has been one of the chief attributes of many of its citizens. Those who have served in this town are legion, beginning with the homesteaders who built schools, established a chamber of commerce, an art gallery, maintained roads. Their accomplishments could be read on and on. In keeping with this year's Pioneer Days theme, community service, a pioneer tradition, it is with great pride that we profile Sue McMahon, a most outstanding woman who has given years of community service to 29 Palms and its people. She is perhaps best identified in her role as volunteer to the Methodist Church, American Field Service Student Exchange Program, and the 29 Palms Historical Society. Sue arrived in 29 Palms in June of 1957 with her husband Pete and their children, Bruce, Scott, and daughter Lynn, all 6'5" and 2.5. The McMahons, both native Texans and teachers by profession, decided to relocate to California in the mid-50s. California was leading the nation in implementing counseling programs in high schools, which was a program of keen interest to Pete. And I read a little further along in this and also noticed that you have some thespian experience.
Well, yes and no. In college, I majored in speech and English, and theater was included in that. And my real goal in life when I went to college was to get a degree in the language arts. And I had been really impressed by a woman who came to the little town of Clarendon, Texas, where I grew up, and my mother was a member of a club, and she did book reviews. And she would take me, and I loved these book reviews, so I wanted to be a book reviewer. For that reason, I took those courses. Right. Of course, that never worked out, but it did help me get into teaching.
Right. And so have you been on stage or you've just directed plays? Or both?
I've just directed.
Yeah,
nice. Especially at the first schools where Pete was the teacher at the high schools. And we won for the state of Texas first place in one-act plays by a school of less than 100 students.
Oh my gosh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, 1 year.
What a great accomplishment. So I usually start the podcast off by asking what your very first experience with the desert was.
The day we arrived for an interview with Dr. Lautensock, who is the superintendent of the Victor Valley High School District, of which 29 Palms was a part, in late June of 1957, and it was very warm. And someone somehow or other, the office at the high school had a fire. So there was no place for the children and I to be except out on the lawn and under the elm trees that were in front of the small high school. I was trying to bear it, but it was obviously not the most comfortable thing.
Right.
And the assistant principal, who was Tom Nickel at the time, came out to talk with me. So I questioned him and he questioned me, and I said, probably not very nicely, "And how did you happen to end up here?" And he said, well, he was teaching English in Hollywood, I believe, and his wife had severe asthma and was always ill, and they heard about this opening for an English teacher at 29 Palms, and so they moved, and since that point, her health had improved dramatically, and they had even been able to have a child. And he was a really nice guy. Then he said, but, and you had to have known Tom Nickel to understand this. I didn't know him, and so I took him very literally. He said, we're thinking of moving to Rice. because it's getting pretty crowded here in 29 Palms. So if you're an old timer and you know where Rice used to be, and he was pulling my leg. Then after the interview, Pete came out, and I just wanted to go home, and he said, well, I need to make a decision of whether to sign the contract or not.
Wow.
And if I don't sign it today, Dr. Lautensack has to go to L.A., and he doesn't want to do that. And so we went to lunch, and we talked it over, and because I said, I can live anywhere for 2 years. That was 60 years ago.
And you're still here. So.
And I'm still here.
Yeah. So where were you coming from at that point when you actually came for the interview?
We were coming from, can't remember the name of the town, near L.A. where Pete's brother lived. And,
okay. So were you still living in Texas at the time?
We were still living in Texas.
Oh, my goodness.
And we were just in California looking for a position. And he really had not been offered any positions anywhere, so he went to the CTA office in L.A. and spoke with Dr. Lautensack there, and that was when he was offered that and other jobs, but this is the one we
Wow.
picked.
So how did that all go with then you had to go back to Texas and pack everything up and move? How was that whole process?
Well, as you can imagine, with 3 little children and with deciding what furniture we really needed, one of the things that we brought with us, which was the silliest thing I can imagine, was a tower that was 100 feet tall that brought in television, because television was brand new. And we knew that they had a mountain station here somewhere, but you needed a tower or you needed a tall antenna to get it, and we brought that, which of course was never used. But it was a big move for us, and as I said, I had thought I would be here very briefly.
Yeah.
The children absolutely loved the desert because it was full of little critters and things that they could go out and hunt for. I remember the fact that their socks wore out so fast because they were always full of sand at the end of the day and had to be dumped and got holes in them. And we're constantly buying new socks. But,
do you remember, you said you, after the interview, you said you went and had lunch and talked about it. Do you remember where it was that you had lunch? And
well,
is that a place
I can
that's
remember
still here?
the location. I do not know what the little cafe was called, but it was on the north side of 29 Palms Highway, and it may have been what later was moved across the highway to the corner and was Ford's Restaurant. Okay. But it wasn't Ford's. I don't remember the name of it.
Right.
But the lady who was the cook there was the mother of a good friend of mine.
Okay.
That later became.
Right. Yeah. Obviously, 2 years passed. When do you think it was that you kind of gave yourself over to this place?
Within the first year, because, well, for example, we were at the art gallery. We were trying to get acquainted with the area, and we went to the art gallery, and I saw a John Hilton painting of mountains that were so pink. And I said, in my smart aleck way, everybody knows that mountains are not that pink. And maybe it was within that, either that day or soon after, that I actually saw the mountains and the color that they were. It was just beautiful and breathtaking. And I came to the conclusion, and the people were really, really nice. We had arrived, and our furniture was not here. We had to find a place to live, and there were very few places to rent at that time because this is 1957, soon after the Marine Corps had arrived, and very little housing, extra housing in 29 Palms. But the principal, Mary and Ted Hayes, were super wonderful to us. They introduced us to Mr. Bagley and Mrs. Bagley at the grocery store and said, you're going to have to give them credit because teachers don't get paid till the end of the month after they've taught. So there was no money after we moved at the beginning of the month, and the Bagleys did that with no
hesitation. Right.
And I began to open my eyes. And there were those mountains that were that pink.
And they still are. I mean, it's amazing to me, too. Every morning and evening I say it's like a different artist is painting the sky. It's beautiful.
Yeah. And people were nice, and the children loved it. They would play out and come in with sand in their shoes and socks, and socks wore out really fast.
Right.
There were a lot of things that I had to get used to.
Do you remember what some of those things were?
Well, just the heat, It was still in June and in August.
Right. So he interviewed in the end of June.
Yeah.
When you moved in August. Oh, boy. Oh, my goodness.
And meetings for the school district were held in Victorville, so he would, there was travel involved. I don't know, it was just I had to open my eyes. I had to actually learn to appreciate what was there. In December of that year, when school got out for Christmas vacation, we played tennis every day, for heaven's sakes, at Lucky Park. I was able to do that sort of thing in those days.
Sure, yeah.
And I assumed that it would be like that every winter after.
Oh.
Of course, it is not, but
No.
that winter, December, was lovely, and
They were breaking you in gently. That's really great. Now, your kids, are they here? Or have they moved on?
they've moved on.
Okay.
And the oldest one, Bruce, he was here just this weekend. He's retired from the Park Service and the Border Patrol, and he is about to be 70. He lives in Utah. The second son was a dentist in San Diego until just this spring when he retired, sold his practice and retired. They have a cabin in Montana and are going to increase the size of that and live there 5 months a year, and somewhere else to be determined for the rest of that time. They have 2 sons, and Bruce has 1 daughter. And then my daughter Lynn is a professor at, I always have trouble with this because the university is in Arizona. Maybe it'll come to me in just a minute. But she lives in Santa Fe.
Oh, beautiful.
And she is the head of the department that teaches teachers and administrators how to be better teachers and administrators by computer.
Oh, wow.
I mean, the whole department, that's how they teach. They have,
like online.
yeah, online at Prescott College in
Arizona, yeah.
And,
it's lovely there. Have you ever been?
No, I never have.
It's a high point of Arizona. I remember when I visited Arizona, that was my first experience with the desert. And I was looking at these mountains in Phoenix, and as the plane was landing, and I was thinking, are those billboards? I've never seen anything like that before. But we drove up, we took a tour to the Grand Canyon, and we had to go through Prescott, and because of its elevation, it attracts all kinds of weather. So in Phoenix, it was 85 degrees in, I think that was December that we were there. And then when we drove up to Prescott, it was snowing. And then when we got to the canyon, of course, on one side of the rim it was snow and the other side was not. So it was just a really interesting. So yeah, Prescott's pretty cool.
So I get to see her about every other month. When she's there, she drives over to see about Mother.
Yeah. Thinking about what is here in 29 Palms today, compared to like where you came to. Talk about some of the most drastic changes that you've experienced here.
Well, of course, the population has increased greatly. At the time, on that August, when we were visiting the high school, there were 225 students in the high school.
Total.
And they came from Morongo Valley, Yucca Valley, Joshua Tree, and all points anywhere and were bused to the high school. Now, I don't know how large Yucca Valley High School is, but over 1,000 students, I imagine, and 29 Palms has 700 or 800, and everything is offered. Everything was offered then, too. It was a good school, and I've talked with students who now, of course, are all older and grown and remember me very kindly.
I imagine you had a lot of students that had parents that were in the service, like their dads were stationed here. Was that difficult when they would come in and go like that?
Absolutely. That was the thing that was very disturbing to Pete, except that he said it's amazing how well they adjust wherever they've been before and then arrive in 29 Palms, and they probably were taking courses that we don't offer or that we had to make allowances for those things. and they always seemed to be assimilating and doing really well. Said, in fact, maybe it was better for them because they learned early on in life how to be
adaptable and
do what you can do wherever you are,
or bloom where you're planted, if you will.
He's was really proud of so many of the students, and he was the one who began the program of scholarships for students at the end of the year who were going on to college. He just sat down and dialed numbers of all the places in town and asked if they would donate money, and it began. And that program of scholarship that is done every end of the year in 29 Palms High School is a big program.
What a nice legacy to leave behind. That's awesome. Was the college here? Probably not when you moved here. How soon after?
No, it wasn't. And I'm trying to remember exactly when. It was, I don't remember dates and exactly how it was, but as time passed and that bus trip from Morongo Valley to 29 Palms was so difficult for those students, and they were getting bigger and bigger, and they were going to build a high school where Copper Mountain College is now. That property belonged to at the beginning, I should explain that 29 Palms High School was in the Victor Valley High School District. The elementary school was the Morongo Elementary. And it was, I think, probably 2 years after we moved here that there was a vote that the community voted to unify the two. And then, again, the Marine base. The war was over. The Marines had taken over the base because originally before that it had been a Navy base, and before the Navy it was I think it may have been Army that trained glider pilots.
Yeah, the glider pilots,
So everything was increasing. Well, the plan was to build a unified school in that property where Copper Mountain College is now. That belonged to the Morongo Unified School District. It was, I don't know what I think there were some political things going on there, and for some reason or other it did not occur, and they went ahead and built the high school in Yucca. Then my children had gone to high school with all these kids from Morongo and Yucca Valley and Joshua Tree, and now they were playing football against each other. But the year that Bruce graduated from high school, they played against their friends.
Oh my gosh! Was that Battle of the Bell? Is that what they call that?
Well, that started soon after.
Right.
But,
so, what are some of your fondest memories of community events? Because you have been so involved in the community, as we heard in the article, and that you were honored as part of Pioneer Days. What are some of the things that
we always enjoyed Pioneer Days. It was always fun, and everybody, including every class at the high school, would build a float, and it would just be a big deal. It's not exactly that way anymore, but it was fun, and I went to my first weed show. I remember vividly the weed show, and there were several events that took place all at the same time at the junior high, which of course was the high school originally. I saw a weed show and saw an arrangement by Ada Hatch in which she used this cactus, and I can't remember the kind of cactus it was, but by putting these pads together she had a perfect jackrabbit.
Oh my gosh.
I'll never forget that. And I was truly impressed. So the art of that was wonderful.
Yeah.
People were always kind to me. I stayed at home for the first, because Lynn was still a baby and I wasn't about to start teaching. And then when she was old enough to go to kindergarten, I joined the substitute staff. And that worked for me much better than having a class all my own all the time. Sometimes I did take a class for maybe a period of time while they were hiring somebody new. But for 40 years, I substitute taught in all the schools. And every once in a while now, someone will recognize me that was a third grader. And,
oh, my goodness.
and say, "Oh, Mrs. McMahon, I'm so glad to see you." And they do. They, of course, Pete saw a child in the grocery store one time that came up to us as we were in the grocery store and she said, hello to Mrs. McMahon. He said, oh, you mean Mrs. McMahon? And so...
So did you have a reputation?
I had a reputation for being tough.
Uh-huh.
And I was, because you have to be if you're a substitute.
Yeah.
They don't think you're a real teacher. You're there, and they figure that it's...
Playtime.
Your fair game. And I did.
You held your own. That's great.
One day I was lining a class up to go to the buses at the end of the day, and one of the children said, did you have a good time today, Mrs. McMahon? And I said, you know, when I came in here this morning, I had black hair. Well, if you know me, my hair has been white for...
That's funny. When did you get involved with the museum, the Old Schoolhouse Museum?
Well, when Pete retired, I always say he graduated from 29 Palms High School, he was asked by Jenny Salisbury, who had worked with him.
Who I think wrote this article that I read from. Yeah, she did.
And was a retired, Navy. Her husband was the head of the hospital at the base. And she had worked with him in scholarships. She asked him if he would come and help. And he did. He became the secretary of the Historical Society. Well, as in practically everything we did, we more or less did them together. When he was at the high school, he's the one who was asked by the principal to start an American Field Service program. I don't know if you know what AFS is, but it is probably the original exchange program for students from all over the world to come to the United States and for students from the United States to go abroad. He contacted people and that program was started at the high school, and it is not active now in 29 Palms, unfortunately. Yeah. But we worked with it for years, and when he did that, of course, he gave me a job, and my job was family finding.
Right.
We've hosted 2 students over the years, a girl from Laos who is still our daughter. She now lives in Hawaii. You know, she's the 4th child. Then a girl from Indonesia.
Okay.
But in the meantime, there were probably, I would guess, 60 students over the years that lived in 29 Palms, and I would find families and we would do counseling with them.
Did any of your kids exchange?
No. Lynn really wanted to. And when she asked me about it, I said, well, you know, we have to give those opportunities to other than us that are... I don't know why I said that. I don't know why I thought that. I mean, I wasn't lying to her. I really thought she would have loved to do that, but she didn't get to.
That's just not meant to be. That's all. Yeah.
But she is very close to Pooh, who is the Laotian daughter.
Oh, okay. That's nice. They forged that friendship. That's really great. So, for anybody who would say, you know, Sue, I'm thinking about moving to the desert, what kind of advice would you give them, or what insight would you give them?
And I've known many people who just moved to the desert, usually Marine wives, and they would be having exactly the same attitude that I had at the beginning. And I would just say, wait until this evening and look at the sky. Open your eyes. There's beauty all around. Yeah.
Is there anything else that you were thinking of that you wanted to share about?
Well, after Pete became involved with the Historical Society and then I continued to sub, I had cancer. I was worried. The doctor was worried about my being exposed to anything in the classroom. So I had to give that up. My last assignment with the school district was at Condor Elementary with my good friend, who is, as far as I'm concerned, the best teacher ever. She is a person who teaches teachers or works with teachers in the district. But Doris Lawless asked me to work with her as a co-teacher with a combination kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade at Condor Elementary. That was my last assignment. I loved it. Yeah. She loved it. We worked together. We did a program about the history of 29 Palms based on Helen Bagley's book, Sand in My Shoe, when the Bagley mural was dedicated in whatever year that was. Our children were acted out the play of how the Bagleys came to the desert on just before Thanksgiving, and they had canned beans for Thanksgiving dinner. So I would say that was the most fun I ever had.
That's great. And you're hearing that clock in the background. Sue and I are actually sitting in the old schoolhouse doing this interview. Were you here when this building was moved from its original location?
I was. Pete was on the board at the time, and yes, I was here. And then, but I was still subbing at the time, and the people who had started the gift shop were needing help. And so when I retired, I started to help Betty Holmes, who was one of those people. And I knew nothing about retail sales, I mean, for heaven's sakes. But I did get very involved.
You learned, yeah. And now what are you doing as part of did they call that the research library?
Right.
Okay.
Yes, I do filing. I say, I never got to go to kindergarten when I was in Texas, so I've learned to cut and paste and file things in our files.
Right. What kind of things do people bring in?
Well, they bring in, it's amazing. I don't really know how to explain that, but things that were used in the earlier days, and then, of course, what I'm doing is looking for written information, which can be filed under people that were homesteaders, anything about them or anything about the organizations and groups that are here in the desert, all over the desert, so that there are things to research when people come in, whatever it is that they're looking for, we can help them find them.
What kind of people do come in and use that room?
Well, everybody does. Recently, a family that was related to one of the homesteaders that there was an article in the Desert Trail about recently about this Mr. Bixby, who homesteaded near where the high school actually is, and his family, extended family, several people all came in and they were doing research about him. And of course, we are so fortunate that we have the files of Art Kidwell, who was a ranger at our park and who wrote several books about the desert. And his files are extensive, and so people come in sometimes to find out things and to look into his files, and we're able to help them with that. It's varied.
Well, I was surprised when I came into this museum for the very first time. A friend of mine was visiting from L.A., and we had driven by it a couple of times when he'd been here before, and he goes, we need to stop in there, because I had never stopped in. So finally one day we came back. I think we were out at the Palms in Wonder Valley and had some breakfast, and then we came back and we stopped in, and we came into this room and saw the two bookcases that are full of notebooks. And in those notebooks are deeds from people that were the original, of the original folks.
They are the papers that were required by the government when someone homesteaded.
Okay.
The 160 acres, and so it's all about them, and then proof that they actually built the little cabin that was necessary and lived there 3 years. They were in the desert. They were kindly allowed a month away from the desert in the middle of the summertime because there was no electricity.
Right.
Those were a project that a former president, Bill Holmes, did at one time, and those of us who could would adopt a homesteader. And help pay for it because it was an expensive thing.
Sure.
What I've forgotten to tell you is probably the most important thing I do now.
Well, tell us.
and I've been doing this for a number of years, is that we have school tours. The third grades in California study the community.
Okay.
And here is a school, an early school. And so it's a perfect place for teachers to bring kids. And Doris Lawless and I and other retired teachers and other people that help us out do these tours. I just this morning got a call from a first grade teacher in Yucca Valley, and they're going to bring 4 classes next month, and we will do a tour. We have a little booklet that has been made up of photographs of things that are on display, of the artifacts. First place, we teach them what the word artifact means.
Right.
And that clock that sounded is one of the most interesting things to explain to children because it's a regular school clock, built for us, especially by a person who worked at the school district office and said, you need a school clock. And they are different from other clocks. I don't have time
it goes from 1 to 30.
Yeah. Well, that's because of the days in the month. What month is it? That hand will point to the number of days that April has, and things like that. We get to explain all that.
Yeah, that's very cool.
And we get to explain that typewriter up there on top of that piano is an early computer.
Yes, it is.
And that the flag has only 48 stars, and why.
Yeah.
The backboard, you use chalk to write. It's truly a fun experience.
Yeah. Well, and I know that they're also working on a fundraiser for the Historical Society to raise money for the expansion.
Right.
Because I met you on one of the Friday night lecture series talks, and this room, I think they had the desks were moved out or somewhere.
Moved all around.
Right, exactly. And then there were chairs inside, and there were only a limited number of spots. And when I came in with the person I came with, there were 3 tickets left, and we got the last 2. So it's a very popular series that's happening. So you all are going to expand. I think I heard today it'll seat 200 people.
Right.
Which is amazing.
That is going to be a wonderful thing. It's a big project. It's going to be, but it's been a need for a long, long time because we share that with the Park Service Association, and they find the speakers, and they're highly popular, especially the ones where the children of the homesteaders talk about their parents.
Yeah, and that was the night I was here. It was the Dunns, and their sister came in from out of town, and the 2 boys were here. They had some Super 8 film of like some of the parades that happened, and it was really interesting. But I think...
And people got turned away from that, which has made them most unhappy.
Right.
And so we need that.
Right, but I think the thing that impressed me the most was the community that was here in this room. I don't know why it's affecting me this way. But it was, you could just feel how special it was.
It was.
People knew each other, and it was a real community feel, and that was lovely. So,
and that loveliness is what converted me. There was a period of time when Pete thought about we would move on to because he really wanted to come to California and be in the mountains where he could fish. And
no fishing here.
It ended up here. But we never did, and don't regret it. And, of course, because of my advanced stage in life at this point, my children worry about me and think I should move to wherever. Well, my friends are here.
Right, exactly. It's harder when you do. It's a higher level of friendship that you have with these people. I can, you could just feel it in that room that night. So they're almost like your family.
And I have a purpose. I mean, a lot of people at 89, which I'm about to be, really don't. They never get out of their house. I would go crazy if I had to be where I couldn't. I mean, the time may come when I will need help getting out of the house.
Sure.
But I love doing this school tours. Keeps me young. And I like being with people who are so knowledgeable about our past. Pat Remington is a source of information, and her memory is totally amazing to me.
She's been on the podcast, and I'm reading her book, about the adobe houses. There's some amazing stuff in there. So,
well, speaking of books, we have those books, the books that are available here at our gift shop, and I am rereading In the Shadow of the Palms 1 and In the Shadow of the Palms 2 by Art Kidwell, which was interviews he did with people who lived here, who were still alive at the time, and that he's interviewed, and they tell what their experiences were and why they came to the desert.
I will put that in. There's a portion on the website where we'll have the photo that we're going to take after we're done talking, but I'll put a link to that book. I'm sure it's available, or a link to the museum so people can check it out and come and get it. I really appreciate you taking the time away from your filing to talk with us today. There was a lot of great stories in there. So thank you for sharing your desert experience with us.
I enjoyed.
Good.
I wasn't thinking I would, but
I told you.
Thanks so much for listening to the Desert Lady Diaries podcast. I want you to know how much I appreciate you taking the time to tune in. If you heard something that inspired or enlightened you, I'd love to hear about it. Send an email to desertladydiaries@gmail.com or start a discussion with other listeners at the Desert Lady Diaries Facebook page. Marijuana's been around for a long time, long before you and I, really. But for those of us who don't really indulge, we know very little about it. CBD, THC, edibles, hemp. Well, next week, Barbie Summers from Mary Jane University will be here to help sort it out, talking about her own personal discoveries with it, as well as events she produces to educate and inform. If you're not signed up as a weekly subscriber on one of the podcast platforms but would like a weekly reminder when a new episode comes out, sign up for the weekly newsletter by either emailing desertladydiaries@gmail.com or go to the website and click on the weekly newsletter button. Thanks so much for listening.